Bible with you, Psalm 16 is where we are going to be today. Late Friday night when I got the news about Dwight, and then Saturday as I was kind of thinking about this morning, and I was thinking and praying, do we take a break from this series and Psalms that we're in? Do we kind of take a 1 week off from that and do a sermon, specifically around grief or loss or tragedy or hope or something like that? And as I was thinking through and praying about that, and I was looking back at Psalm 16, I realized that, I remember that God is sovereign, that when God had us scheduled to do Psalm 16 this morning, He already knew what was going to transpire with Dwight. And in reading back through this psalm, I believe this is exactly what God has for us this morning. That this is exactly what we need to hear this morning, because there's so much hope in Psalm chapter 16. This is what I kind of had down in my notes, even before Friday, even before Dwight's passing. This is what I had down as kind of the main theme, the main point, the main idea of Psalm chapter 16. It's this: there is nothing that the world can throw at you that you cannot endure if you are confident and content in God alone. And that's what this psalm is going to teach us. There's absolutely nothing that this world can throw at us that we won't have the strength to endure if our confidence and our contentment are in God alone. And the reality is, as we've seen just this week, that the world is going to throw lots of things at us. Right? This world is broken, it's fallen, it's not as it should be. This world will crush us. I know that's kind of depressing. I know that's not great news, but we've got to realize the reality of the world we live in. This world will crush us. Right? What Moses says in this psalm that he wrote, he says, at best we get 70, 80 long, painful, difficult years. Right? The best we can hope for in this life is 70 or 80 years that are filled with pain and sorrow. Life in this world is really a string of moments filled with happiness and peace that are stringed together by other moments of sorrow and despair and pain. That's what life in this world is. And so the reality that we need to remember is that every single one of us will experience one of two things. Every single one of us will either, one, experience an untimely death, or maybe even worse, we will live long enough to see all of those around us that we love and cherish experience an untimely death. But either way, this world is going to throw things at us that feel like it is crushing us, that feels like we can't continue and go on. But again, what we are going to see in this psalm this morning is that there is nothing, not even death, there is nothing that this world can throw at us that we won't have the ability to endure if our confidence and our contentment are in God alone. So Psalm 16, it's written by David, and we don't know exactly when it was written by David, but what most people say is they believe that this psalm was written before David actually became king of Israel. See, before David takes over the throne, before he is given the crown, this guy named Saul was king of Israel. But God came to Saul, and God said, Saul, you are no longer my chosen king. You are no longer my guy. David is now the chosen king for Israel. But again, Saul didn't just step back. He didn't just give up the throne. He wanted to remain in control over his throne. So David is in this position where he has been anointed king, but he hasn't yet been inaugurated as the king. He knows that he's supposed to be the king, but he's not yet the king. And so in that time, Saul kind of goes on this power rage. He goes on this rampage where he wants to take David out. He wants to take out any threat to his power, so he tries to have David killed. So David is in this season where he is on the run. He is a fugitive, essentially. He is homeless, living, hiding out in caves, on the run for his life. And most people think that it's during that season. It's during that season where he is on the run for his life, where his life is in danger, that he writes this psalm. So this is what David writes in Psalm chapter 16. He says, "Keep me safe, O God, for I have come to you for refuge. I said to the Lord, you are my master. Every good thing I have comes from you. The godly people in the land, they are my true heroes. I take pleasure in them, but troubles multiply for those who chase after other gods. I will not take part in their sacrifices of blood or even speak the names of their gods. Lord, you alone are my inheritance, my cup of blessing. You guard all that is mine. The land you have given me is a pleasant land. What a wonderful inheritance. I will bless the Lord who guides me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. I know the Lord is always with me, and I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. No wonder my heart is glad, and I rejoice. My body rests in safety. And then listen to this. This is where it all builds up to. I think this is what God has for us today. For you will not leave my soul among the dead, or allow your Holy One to rot in the grave. You will show me the way of life, granting me the joy of your presence and the pleasures of living with you forever. So what we see in this psalm is that in spite of everything that David is walking through in that season of life, he is able to walk through that. He's able to endure that season with this sense of joy and with this sense of peace. And what we see, what we learn here is the reason he's able to endure that season with joy and with peace is because we see that his confidence and his contentment are in God alone. So first of all, in verse 1, we see that all of David's confidence, all of David's hope is centered around who God is. So look again at verse 1. David says, "Keep me safe, O God, for I have come to you for refuge." Remember, David, as he writes this, he is literally most likely running for his life. He is in danger. And he says, God, I come to you alone for safety. I come to you alone for refuge. I come to you alone for hope. It's this posture where David is saying, my hope is not in my sword. My hope is not in all the men who are on my side. My hope is not in the training that I have received for battle. It's not in my ability to fight off Saul. My hope is in you alone, God. Now, the thing you've got to realize about David is that when it came to battle, when it came to fighting, David is no slouch. Right? You've got to realize who David is. David was the guy who, if you grew up in church or you went to VBS, he was the one who killed the giant Goliath. When everybody else, when all the soldiers of Israel are terrified on the sidelines, not willing to fight, David is the one who chops the head off the giant. Right? David, it tells us to protect his sheep. He killed lions and bears. There's another time, one of my favorite stories, where when Saul is trying to have David killed, Saul sends David on this mission where Saul says, hey, you need to go to the Philistines, who are their enemies. You need to go to the Philistines, and I want you to kill 100 Philistines for me. Saul thinks, surely if David, one guy, goes and tries to kill 100 Philistines, he's going to get taken out. But to Saul's surprise, David comes back alive. Not only did he kill 100 Philistines, David killed 200 Philistines. Right, so David is a bad dude. And all the guys who are with David are bad dudes. I know that, from going to VBS and from Sunday school as a kid, we always have this picture. We think of the flannel graph, and we think of David and all his guys with, these little tunics and, little sash, and they're all skinny, and, they got flip-flops on. But that's not who David was. You've got to realize, David and his boys, they're guys that if you're in downtown on a Friday night and you turn a corner and you see them coming at you, you're turning and going the other way. David is not somebody that you wanted to mess with. But despite that, right, despite his strength, despite the fact that there was virtually nobody who could take him out, it's interesting, David doesn't say, hey, I'm relying on my strength. I'm relying on my skill. I'm relying on my training. He doesn't think, he says, God, I come to you alone for refuge. He says, God, you are the only one that I put my hope in. You are the only one who can keep me safe. David is running to God alone for refuge. And so here's a question for us today that we need to ask. When life is hard, When you are going through difficult seasons, is God the only one you run to for refuge? Is God the only one you run to as your source of hope and peace? When things get difficult, are you chasing after God for refuge, or are there other things? Are there other gods that you run to try to find hope in? And if you do, look what David says about that in verse 4. He says, troubles multiply for those who chase after other gods. Essentially, what he's saying is that when you, instead of running to the one true God for refuge, when you run to other little gods, that only leads to trouble. That only leads to more pain. That only leads to more fear. Goodness, isn't that true? Right? That whatever we run to for peace, for hope, for comfort, other than God, it eventually always lets us down, doesn't it? Never does what it promises to do. So again, the question I think we need to just honestly ask ourselves is when things get hard, what are the things I run to? Or maybe even when life is good, what are the things I run to for hope? What am I trusting in? What is the object of my ultimate hope in life? So for some of you, I think a common one is money. Right? A lot of us, we may not realize it, but we put our hope in money. We run to money as our refuge. And I think I've told you guys before, but this is one I struggle with. If I'm honest with you, I am an incredibly selfish person. And my wife is probably the most generous person I've ever met in my entire life, so it makes me look even more selfish, right? It's not fun. But I am an incredibly selfish person. I want to hoard everything that I have for myself. I want to keep it for myself instead of being generous and giving it away. And the reason I want to do that, the reason I'm tempted to hoard all my resources for myself is not even necessarily because I want to go and buy a bunch of stuff. It's because I want to take that money and put it away and save it and invest it so that I know I have financial security to provide for my family one day when I retire. That's why I want to do that. That's why I'm tempted to be greedy and selfish. All right, now, obviously, saving and investing is wise, and obviously, we should do that. But see, what I realized through this passage is that when I'm doing that, when I am being disobedient to God because I'm being selfish instead of being generous, when I do that, I'm putting my hope in money. I'm looking at my bank account and what's in there, or really what's not in there, is my source of refuge. I'm thinking that I have the ability to provide for myself. I'm wrongly thinking, okay, God, I'm not going to be generous. I'm going to be selfish because I really don't trust you to provide for me. Instead, I have to trust myself to provide for me. And David would say, when I'm doing that, I'm running to the things of the world for refuge. I'm not trusting in God as my source of refuge. And he says, when I do that, that only leads to trouble. Right? When our ultimate hope is in anything but God, it only leads to trouble. Or think about this in light of what we're walking through with COVID. And I know that we are all just so exhausted and so ready to be past this. And it's just so discouraging because, even a week and a half ago, didn't it seem like, hey, we're kind of out of the woods. We're kind of through this. And then all of a sudden, everything's spiking and ramping up again. But when it comes to COVID, and I think about this, man, I am so incredibly grateful for the vaccine and that I was able to get the vaccine. And listen, by the way, as a side note, I know that we are living in such a stupid, polarized climate. And I say that because really there's no better way to say it. Our society and climate right now is just so stupidly polarized. So I know even by saying that, some of you are like, oh, he's making this political statement. No, he's not. So chill out, okay? Right? But I'm grateful for the vaccine. I was grateful that I was able to get the vaccine. In part because in October of 19, I had this lung infection, and I was in the hospital for a week, and they had to do surgery on my lung, and I had 3 chest tubes coming out from this infection that was eerily similar to COVID, and so now my right lung is janked up and doesn't really work well. Right? So I'm grateful that I was able to get the vaccine. I'm so grateful for the technology and the science and all the people who work so hard to develop that. I'm grateful for that, but here's the reality. When I went and got the vaccine, while I was incredibly grateful for it, and while I think it can be viewed as that's a gift from God, my ultimate hope was never in the vaccine. Right? My ultimate hope was still always in God. And see, if my ultimate hope had been in the vaccine instead of in God, then the last week and a half would have been a nightmare. Right? Because we're seeing in the news now with this variant more and more cases that are breaking through the vaccine, and that people with the vaccine are now catching it in greater numbers. So if my ultimate hope was always in that, then man, just reading the news the last week and a half would send me into a panic. That's what David is talking about here, right? That when the ultimate source of our hope, when the ultimate source of our comfort, when the ultimate thing that we are running to for refuge is anything but God, it's going to let us down. It's going to fall short. It's going to be like we are always standing on sinking sand. But if God is our refuge, if God is our hope, then our confidence is in something that is unmovable and unshakable. Anything other than God that you can run to for hope, for refuge, for security, is going to let you down. Only God is solid ground. And so David is saying, God, all of my confidence is in you. I can persevere. I can go through this time on the run, this time where I'm in danger, because, God, I'm not trusting in myself. I'm not trusting in my skills. I'm not trusting in the guys who are on my side. God, I am trusting in you, and you are sovereign and in control. But then what we see next is, not only is David confident in God, David is totally and completely content with what he has in God. Look at verse 5. David says, Lord, you alone are my inheritance, my cup of blessing. You guard all that is mine. The land you have given me is a pleasant land. What a wonderful inheritance. I will bless the Lord who guides me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. I know the Lord is always with me, and I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. So this inheritance language that David uses seems to be sort of metaphorical. Because here, when he talks about the land, he's clearly referencing the promised land that God gave the people of Israel as their inheritance. But he's using that picture of the promised land as a metaphor for something greater than this physical land. He's saying God has given Israel this incredible blessing, but I think what David is getting at is that the real blessing, the true blessing that God gave Israel was not a bunch of land, not a bunch of dirt, but it was that God gave Israel himself. That God gave Israel his presence to them. That he came and dwelt in their midst. That's what David is really getting at there. He's saying, God, I have you. Right? Notice there, he says, God, you alone are my inheritance. He doesn't say the land is my inheritance. He says, God, you are my inheritance. He says, God, you will always be with me. He says, I will not be shaken because you are beside me. It's clear that David is living with this posture where he's saying, God, since I have you, I have enough. Since I have you, I will be content. But remember what he's going through. He's the chosen king, but he doesn't yet have the crown. But he doesn't have this posture of, hey, God, once I get that crown and that throne, then I'll be content. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, once Saul is dead and no longer chasing me, then I'll be content. He doesn't say that. It's not, God, once I know I'm safe and I have a palace and I'm not hiding out in this cave, then I'll be content. He doesn't say that. He says, God, you alone are my inheritance. David has this posture where he has come to the place of being able to believe, if I have God, then I have enough. Listen, for us today, in our culture, having that posture is so incredibly hard, isn't it? And here's part of the reason why it's so hard. Our entire economy is built on getting you and I to believe that we don't currently have enough to be content. Right? Our entire economy, billions and billions of dollars in advertising, are all to try to get you to believe the lie that you don't currently have what you need to be content. And it's with everything, right? It's, hey, your old school regular liquid dish detergent that's worked fine for the last 30 years, man, that's old. You don't need that anymore. Now you need new fancy pods for your, dishes. And, they're not really going to be clean unless you buy these new pods, which, of course, are twice as expensive, right? Everything, down to our toiletries, it's all built on getting you to believe that what you have is not good enough, that you can't be content as you are. Right? And so think about what would happen in our country, right? Just think about this. This is crazy. What would happen if tomorrow morning every single person in America woke up and said, you know what? I'm good. I'm content. My phone's not the greatest. The pictures aren't, 4K, but hey, it works. I can send texts. I can make calls. I don't need the newest iPhone. Or my purse is a little beat up, but it still holds everything just fine. I don't need that new purse. Or, my car's not the fanciest, it's not the nicest, but it's still getting me from point A to point B. Right? I've got enough. If every person in America woke up tomorrow and believed that, literally our economy would crumble, wouldn't it? Our nation would melt down. Everything in our society is preaching to you every single day, you don't have enough. You can't be content as it is today. You need more. And David, who is living in a cave on the run for his life, says, God, I don't have anything else. I don't even have my safety. But in you, I can be content. And finding contentment in God alone, that may be the most countercultural thing that you can do in our society. Right? Finding your contentment in God, that may be the most rebellious, defiant thing you can do in a culture like ours. And so again, let me just ask you this question. Are you going through life with this mindset where you've believed this lie? You think, man, I need all of these exterior things in order to be content. Or have you come to the place where you can honestly say, God, as long as I have you, I'm good and I will be content? Or do you think you need that new title at work? You need that little bit of a raise. You need the house in that neighborhood. You need that car. You need, a spouse, or you need, whatever it is there something in your mind where you think, man, I can't really be content. I won't really be happy until I grab onto that. See, by the way, when we think that we need anything other than God to be content, the Bible actually calls that idolatry. And it's kind of a big deal. It's no small matter. Is there anything that you're chasing after, that you're running to, thinking that once you get that, you're going to be content? And if it's anything other than God, it's going to let you down. Look at what David says in the next verse, in verse 9, about how he's been able to find this contentment in God and having God. He says, no wonder my heart is glad and I rejoice, and my body rests in safety. David said that when our confidence and when our contentment are in God, man, that's when we can truly be glad. That's when we can truly rejoice. That's when we truly have peace. But here's where all this builds to. Here's really the key reason why we can endure anything if our confidence and contentment are in God. Here's the basis for that truth and for that promise. It's verse 10 and 11. He concludes this psalm. He says, because... saying that the reason I can endure this, the reason I can have peace, the reason I can have joy because my confidence and contentment are in you are because, verse 10, you will not leave my soul among the dead or allow your Holy One to rot in the grave. And you will show me the way of life, granting me the joy of your presence forevermore. David is saying here as he closes this song, said the reason that I can endure my current situation is because even if the worst case scenario plays out, right, even if Saul finds me, even if Saul takes my head and kills me, David says, the reason I can endure is because I know that won't be the end of my story. He says, even if Saul kills me, my God will not leave me among the dead. That there's a day coming that He will raise me to life, and I will have the joy of living in His presence, the pleasure of being by His side forevermore. If you fast forward 1,000 years, we get to the book of Acts. In Acts 2, there's this thing, this celebration, this festival called Pentecost that's happening. This great crowd comes and gathers, and the Apostle Peter, one of the earliest followers of Jesus, he gets up at Pentecost in front of this crowd, and he begins preaching this sermon. And in Peter's sermon, he actually quotes this passage. He quotes verses 10 and 11. And when Peter quotes this, he then tells the crowd, he says, hey, by the way, when David said that, David wasn't talking about himself. David was pointing us forward to someone else. And then Peter says, and that someone else that David was pointing forward to was Jesus. Right? What the New Testament tells us is that the reason that David could have this great hope that we see in this psalm, the reason he could endure what he was going through was because Jesus fulfilled what David was talking about here. The reason that David knew God would not leave him among the dead. The reason that David knew that death would not be the end of his story was because 1,000 years later, Jesus was going to be born. And that Jesus would live a perfect life because you and I never could. And having lived a perfect life, He would go to the cross, dying as an innocent man for our sake. And He would be buried in the ground, but God did not leave Jesus among the dead. God did not allow Jesus, His Holy One, to rot in the ground. Because on the third day, He was raised to life. He walked out of the grave, guaranteeing that anyone and everyone who puts their faith and their hope and their trust in Him will live forever in His kingdom. That's the basis of David's hope in this psalm. So for us today, we can be here. We can be in this situation. Now we can be in the midst of such a painful, tragic, horrible situation with the loss of Dwight, knowing that we can endure it. Knowing that God will give us the strength to go on if our confidence and our contentment are in Him alone, because eternal life is coming. Because death never has the final say. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, death has lost its sting. Death is a defeated enemy. Last night I was scrolling through Twitter and I came across this quote from Charles Spurgeon, who was a British pastor in the 1800s and really probably the greatest preacher in modern history. And this is what Charles Spurgeon said. In one of his sermons, he said, "Death in its substance has been removed." The substance of death has been removed, and only a shadow of it remains. Death in its substance has been removed. Now only a shadow of it remains. And listen to what he says. He says, "Nobody needs to be afraid of a shadow. For a shadow cannot stop a man's pathway even for a moment. The shadow of a sword cannot kill, and the shadow of death cannot destroy us." This is why we can endure anything if our confidence and if our contentment are in God alone. It's because even when, not if, because it will, even when the worst possible scenario plays out and death comes our way, death will not have the final word. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, God in life always has the final word for those who trust in Him.